afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're so grateful for your presence and for your attention to these issues that we'll be talking about today. My name is Janet Settle, and I'm part of the steering committee for the Committee for Just Peace in Israel and Palestine, the organizing group for this event. We want to thank all of the event co-sponsors: American Friends Service Committee, American Muslims for Palestine, Chicago Chapter, Arab-Jewish Partnership for Peace and Justice in the Middle East, Chicago Faith Coalition on Middle East Policy, Jewish Voice for Peace, Chicago Chapter, and National Lawyers Guild, Chicago Chapter. I'm struck by what a source of strength and hope it is to have not just the support of all these groups, but to know the ongoing faithful shoulder-to-shoulder working together to bend the arc of justice. So we thank you not just for today. We also want to thank the Crossroads Fund, which has been supporting our work with grants continuously from 2005. We are very grateful for their ongoing faith in our work. So the roadmap. We'll have a brief introduction to today's event and to our speakers. Our speakers will then engage in a moderated discussion, and after that we'll ask them to address your questions, and we'll finish with an action step. The organizers of this event acknowledge our own land's history of genocidal settler colonialism. We live now on the ancestral lands of indigenous peoples. The Council of the Three Fires, the Confederation of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, as well as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, Fox, Kickapoo, and Illinois nations were caretakers of this land before their oppression by European colonists, who committed the crimes of war, forced relocation, taking indigenous children from their families and placing them in assimilationist boarding schools and other tools of white supremacy. Today, the area around Oak Park and Chicago is home to members of 150 indigenous nations. We acknowledge the ongoing structures of colonialism and white supremacy and commit ourselves to the ongoing effort to name, illuminate, and dismantle these structures. This is the 20th year of the existence of the Committee for a Just Peace in Israel and Palestine. Coming of age during a pandemic, a national reckoning on racial justice, and global threats to democratic ideals and practices and to the earth itself demanded a sober consideration of the path forward, one that recognized the genuine urgency of justice-focused movements that eliminated policies and structures that maintain injustice, and that also pointed the way to liberatory movements. We decided to focus on some of the root issues that have vexed those who have been working on Israel-Palestine issues for a long time, and that have been a bewildering stumbling block for those who want to address these issues but don't know how to address the most common accusations of those supporting the status quo. Our fall event featured speakers illuminating the policy analyses and lived experience, informing the growing number of respected human rights groups naming the Israeli regime as apartheid. If you were unable to attend that event, you can access the recording on CJ PIP's YouTube channel. Today, we challenge the notion that supporting Palestinian rights and justice is anti-Semitic. Why this issue? Anyone who works in Palestine solidarity has encountered this accusation. And those who don't work in this arena are also aware of the accusation. From the New York Times to right-wing blogs, to the pronouncements from the Israeli consulate, to Christian Zionist preachers, forced and false connections between Palestine advocacy and anti-Semitism are ubiquitous. To be clear, though, our interest in this issue is not merely instrumental. Feelings and fears about anti-Semitism are as high as they are because we know it as a genuine danger. Why now? One could reasonably ask what took us so long. I don't have a good answer for that, other than that we did come to feel the keen urgency of the current moment. Anti-Semitism has flared periodically in dangerous events and demonstrations throughout the millennia, but even with the knowledge of this long history, we've been shaken to the bone by recent horrors that have awakened smoldering traumas. Anti-Semitism has literally deadly consequences and must be fought with enduring vigilance. Unfortunately, the fight against anti-Semitism has been manipulated and undermined with false notions of what anti-Semitism means. False accusations of anti-Semitism have been weaponized with dangerous real-world consequences for Palestinians, Israelis, Jews, and supporters here of social justice and democracy. And false accusations of anti-Semitism do nothing to increase anyone's safety. Manipulative anti-Semitism accusations are not good for Jews. We also recognize that anti-Semitism is linked to other forms of hatred, that oppression spreads its seeds indiscriminately, and that justice movements are strongest when they address shared oppression. Today, we will be exploring a framework that recognizes the liberatory value of seeing the moral consistency of working for Palestinian rights and fighting anti-Semitism. Thankfully, I can think of no better people to guide us through this exploration. Dima Khalidi is the founder and director of Palestine Legal and is cooperating counsel with the Center for Constitutional Rights. Her work includes advising and representing activists, advocating for the right to speak out for Palestinian freedom, and educating activists in the public about the suppression of the Palestine movement. Rosen is the rabbi of the Tzedek Chicago congregation and the author of Wrestling in the Daylight, a rabbi's path to Palestinian solidarity. He is a co-founder of the Jewish Voice for Peace Rabbinical Council and the Jewish Fast for Gaza. He is currently a fellow in the Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative of Harvard Divinity School. Thank you so much for being with us today. So let's start out with a question about the history of anti-Semitism. Many people talk about anti-Semitism as a movement that grew and had its full expression in Nazi Germany, although we do know that it has a long history. Should anti-Semitism be best understood as the product of a particular historical moment? If not, what does anti-Semitism look like today, and how can we fight it?
Thank you, Janet, and thank you all for being here. Before I begin to address these very, very difficult and vast questions, I want to thank CJ Pitt for having us, particularly to Janet and Karen and Becca for arranging this. This program was literally 2 years in the making, and so I'm very humbled to be part of it, and it's always really a pleasure to be part of the program with CJ Pitt, and it's a particular pleasure to be doing this program together with my good friend Dima. You know, when I thought about that first question, I had a very, very difficult time trying to figure out a way to frame an answer to what is the history of anti-Semitism and what does it look like today. So I'll throw out a few pieces that I think are bullet points that I think I find important, and that hopefully will spur a conversation both between Dima and I, and also eventually with us all. When we talk about the history of anti-Semitism, of course, it goes back to ancient times. It finds its origins in religious hatred that was initiated in the Christian Church. It was religiously focused, but also very much manifest through violence against Jews. And So there's a difference, I think, between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. And I think what we're talking about here is a hatred, a prejudice, hostility, and violence toward Jews because they're Jews, I think is probably a good working definition for our program today. We want to talk about the history of anti-Judaism. That's a whole separate, connected but separate conversation. So really it was a religiously focused hatred and violence. It found, particularly during the Middle Ages, pockets of very horrible and tragic violence against Jewish communities. During the Inquisition in the 15th century, the Catholic Church began to introduce a racial component to it, these blood laws, and we saw a beginning of transition between what was largely a religious ideological hatred into a more racially focused definition. And I think we can trace that historically with the emergence of racialism as an ideology. As Janet mentioned, it found its, I don't know if I would call it its apotheosis necessarily, but it's certainly one of the most tragic events, not only for the Jewish community, but for the world community. And I think when we think of anti-Semitism today, the Holocaust looms particularly large, obviously. To the question of, is it the product of a particular historical moment? I think I would phrase it a little bit differently. I think there's always been a through line throughout history. I think it's ebbed and flowed, and I think largely we find a rise in anti-Semitism whenever there's periods of upheaval, economic, political, social upheaval, is when we find the othering of Jews. And by the way, I want to make a point to say, not exclusively Jews. When I mentioned the Inquisition, Muslims were targeted as well as Jews. So you're going to hear me probably say this a great deal, that I'm not a fan of exceptionalizing anti-Semitism. I think it's a form of hatred that has a great deal in common with other forms of prejudice and racism and xenophobia. It has its own unique qualities, as all of these forms of hatreds do. But I think the root of it ultimately comes, we see it manifest during times of upheaval, and particularly when powers are looking to entrench their power by targeting vulnerable people who have less power. What does it look like today? We'll have more of an opportunity to talk more deeply about the current moment, but I think, as Janet mentioned in her introduction, I think we're seeing a resurgence, certainly, of anti-Semitism in our time. I think we're also seeing a resurgence of violence and hatred against Asian Americans, against Muslims, against many different vulnerable populations, certainly in this country and around the world. So again, I think we need to contextualize what's going on. And I find it problematic. I think it's very important to contextualize. I think it's essential to do that, to understand what is going on, why it's going on, and what are the different forms that we're seeing taking place, and not just to level the playing field and see this as, well, we're seeing a huge wave of anti-Semitism and hatred towards Jews. Well, we need to take a step back and try to understand what that means. And I think it's unfortunate that often those of us who try to contextualize are often accused of dismissing the importance of what's going on. And I think it's quite the opposite. I think if we want to address it, if we want to fight it and eventually eradicate it, we need to understand it. So I think it's very important to have a power analysis. Whenever we see the othering of anybody, whether it's Jews or other historically vulnerable populations, we need to understand who has the power and who does not, and how that power is being wielded. Janet also mentioned the weaponization of anti-Semitism. We need to understand the political map and when these fears are being stoked for political gain. And when we come to talk about Israel-Palestine, I think that's a huge, huge factor. I think we need to differentiate between anti-Semitic acts or violence that is perpetrated by individuals as opposed to state-sponsored prejudice. I think historically, the most dangerous form of anti-Semitism has always been anti-Semitism that is collectively focused, is state-sponsored anti-Semitism against the Jewish people. Again, finding perhaps it's obvious in Nazi Germany, but it's the same with racism, right? I think we're starting to learn a great deal more, or at least many people are learning, opening their eyes to the existence of institutional racism in the world. And there is a difference between someone painting a swastika on a synagogue, as horrible as that is, and how much we need to understand where they came from and condemn it in no uncertain terms and find solidarity with others who are going through that kind of, who are being victimized in that way. That's very different than laws being passed, right? That's very different than political figures in this country who are making common cause with anti-Semites. Or certainly dismissing the importance of anti-Semitism. Charlottesville was a wake-up call, certainly, about the existence of white supremacy in general, but certainly anti-Semitism in this country. It never went away. It's a part of this country's history. And I think because of the political and social and economic moments, we're seeing it starting to bubble up, as we are seeing with other forms of hatred against individual peoples. But I think we need to focus on what is the most dangerous, and where we focus our energies is absolutely essential. I'll just end with this and then hand it over to Dima. I was reading some articles recently about what gets publicized, what kind of anti-Semitism gets publicized in the press. And I noticed, and maybe some of you noticed, that for the better part of a month, a remark made by Whoopi Goldberg on The View was covered every day. It appeared, I think, 7 or 8 times on the front page of the New York Times. And it was I think, a clarifying moment. It was upsetting when it happened for many people, but I think it was a moment to understand. And in the scheme of things, was this really a sign of this greater anti-Semitic wave that's being thrown in through the media? I'm not so sure. And I just want to mention that in the time that this was going on, there were things that were going on that were much, much more worthy of our attention, that flew almost completely under the radar, and I'll just name a few of them. There's a documentary on Fox News by Tucker Carlson, some of you have heard about it, about Hungary, and it trafficked in some very, very disturbing anti-Semitic tropes about George Soros. Carlson and Fox News has been upping the ante in terms of their anti-Semitic conspiracy mongering and not being held to account. This past February, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Paul Gosar appeared at the America First Political Action Conference, led by Nick Fuentes. Everybody in this room should know who Nick Fuentes is. If we don't, we should. He's the leader of a white nationalist Groyper movement. At that event, he praised Hitler and Putin in the same breath. Lauren Boebert, representative, politician in this country, made a joke at a recent rally where she noticed some Jews wearing yarmulkes and asked them if they were there for, quote, reconnaissance. She said this out loud. None of this was covered while the press was busy talking either about Whoopi Goldberg or about BDS, which we'll have the opportunity to talk about. When someone makes a stupid anti-Semitic comment, it's upsetting. When a politician, elected official in this country, is making these comments publicly, that is a sign of something deeper and more insidious. So I'll stop there. And I know I've touched on a number of things, and I'm pretty confident we'll circle back to discuss more deeply.
Thanks, Brent. And I just want to echo my thanks to CJ Kip and to Janet and Karen and everyone who helped organize this. And it's interesting to be back in person and seeing some of your faces again. So thanks to all of you. I guess I don't have a lot to add to what you said, Brad, just in terms of the history of anti-Semitism. What I'd like to focus on is what it looks like today and a little bit more in the current moment. But I think I also, what to me is really important to pull out from history, I guess, is that we often see the scapegoating of communities in order to justify a political agenda, and I think that's where we've seen historically anti-Semitism enacted violently and otherwise. You know, that as Brent said, it hasn't only happened to Jewish people. It has happened in horrific ways to Jewish people, and the Holocaust is one of those prime examples. If we learn only about the Holocaust and we can no longer teach our children about the genocide of Native Americans and the genocide of Africans brought here as slaves, and the genocide of slaves in the US, that we can't have a really clear picture of human history. So I think we have to teach and learn about these realities, these historical realities, in this broader context. And yes, there are peculiarities of anti-Semitism that Brant touched on and mentioned, and there are also similarities with a lot of the kind of justifications for these kinds of acts. And today, I think what's critical is that we see that the resurgence of anti-Semitism, along with the resurgence of horrific, blatant, unfiltered racism, anti-Black, anti-immigrant, xenophobic, anti-Muslim, is all coming from one place, right? The folks who attacked the synagogues and have killed people are the same, have the same ideological framework as, you know, those who marched in Charlottesville. And I think that's the key lesson, right? That this isn't, it isn't really distinct from the folks who are attacking all of our communities of color in particular. And they are also the same folks who oppose Palestinian rights. And I think there's one irony that we can also touch on, which is that, you know, a lot of these folks, like Tucker Carlson, like Donald Trump, right, support Israel, oppose Palestinian rights, and are also anti-Semitic. And why is that? And this, you know, circles back to Israel, and the kind of idealizing Israel as an ethno-nationalist state that it forefronts, that is based on the notion of Jewish supremacy, right? So it's a complicated path that we're taking here, right? There has been historically a targeting, a horrific targeting of Jewish communities, along with other peoples, right? And now we have a situation where the state of Israel has created another, has targeted another people, has created another oppressive reality for Palestinian Arabs, Christians, Muslims alike. And today, I think what's critical is that we see that the resurgence of anti-Semitism, along with the resurgence of horrific, blatant, unfiltered racism, anti-Black, anti-immigrant, xenophobic, anti-Muslim, is all coming from one place, right? The folks who attacked the synagogues and have killed people are the same, have the same ideological framework as, you know, those who marched in Charlottesville. I think that's the key lesson, right? That this isn't, it isn't really distinct from the folks who are attacking all of our communities of color in particular. And they are also the same folks who oppose Palestinian rights. And I think there's one irony that we can also touch on, which is that, you know, a lot of these folks, like Tucker Carlson, like Donald Trump, right, support Israel, oppose Palestinian rights, and are also anti-Semitic. And why is that? And this, you know, circles back to Israel and the kind of idealizing Israel as an ethno-nationalist state that forefronts, that is based on the notion of Jewish supremacy, right? So it's a complicated path that we're taking here, right? There has been historically a targeting, a horrific targeting of Jewish communities, along with other peoples, right? Now we have a situation where the state of Israel has created another, has targeted another people, has created another oppressive reality for Palestinian Arabs, Christians, Muslims alike. So I wanna just point out this important kind of current reality of this kind of synergy between folks who hold anti-Jewish views. This includes Christian Zionists, right, who support Israel fervently, not because they like Jewish people, but because they think that the creation of the state of Israel will accelerate the apocalypse. Yes, right. So there's this synergy between actually anti-Semitic elements and you know, and pro-Israel sentiments. So I think that's one of the important notes about what's going on today, and how that kind of dovetails with what we know is the targeting of Muslim communities, Arab communities, immigrant communities, and a very strong opposition to Palestinian rights in order to support the state of Israel ultimately.
Dima beat me to it a little bit. You know, on the issue of those who profess love for Israel, but also with the same breath are voicing these terrible anti-Semitic tropes. And I think these are two very good examples. You know, there is an alt-right love for the state of Israel because, as Dima mentioned, it's an ethno-national state. You know, and these are white people who want a white state for themselves, and they look to Israel, and they say this over and over again. Many different white nationalist movements have articulated this admiration for Israel because this is a state made up for a specific group of people, right? And they say it's nothing wrong. It's nothing wrong with those other people. We just want a state of our own because our state is being taken away from us. And they lift up Israel as an example, as an ethno-national state, a state that's made for the benefit of one particular group of people. But these are people who absolutely, because of their racial ideology, have no love lost for Jews. But Zionism is something that speaks to them. And Christian Zionism is another great example of this, right? People who, and Christian Zionism has been around as long as Jewish, even a little bit longer than Jewish Zionism, by the way. So Zionism is not a uniquely Jewish movement. It's very much a nationalist movement that has all kinds of religious overtones from an interfaith point of view. But this notion that physically bringing Jews to settle historic Palestine is somehow redemptive, right? And for Zionist Christians, that means it will hasten the coming of the Messiah, and those who accept that Messiah will live well in that land, and those who don't will be consumed in the apocalypse. I think probably everybody in this room is familiar with these tropes. There is a kind of Faustian bargain that the leaders of Israel have been making with anti-Semites, such as Christian Zionists, as well as right-wing nationalists, for a very, very long time. And this goes back, by the way, historically. The Balfour Declaration is a great example of this. Lord Balfour, who was the Foreign Secretary of Great Britain, who promised a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This was before the British mandate even started. Balfour, for many generations in the Jewish community, was lifted up by Zionists as a hero. I mean, there are people who named their children, Jews who named their children after him. This was a turning point for Zionists, a huge gain in terms of their legitimacy, political legitimacy. Lord Balfour was a notorious anti-Semite. He was a main sponsor of the Alien Exclusion Act in England when Jewish refugees from pogroms in Eastern Europe were seeking entrance into England. They passed a law that barred entry, and he's on record as giving speeches in Parliament about the odious nature of these people that they have no place in this country. England has a history of either closing their borders to Jews or even kicking them out back in the 16th century, but that's, again, history. So I think it's important for us to understand that Zionism itself has made common cause with anti-Semites, and largely for cynical political purposes. Anti-Semites such as Balfour and others want their Jews out of their country, so they'll support a place like Israel that will bring them to that place. And Israel demographically needs them in order to maintain a majority, a demographic balance of Jews against non-Jews. So it's a kind of Faustian bargain that I think we need to understand. And we need to unpack, because there's a trope that is very much been at the center of Zionist ideology even before the Holocaust, which is that the world is an inherently dangerous place for Jews, and it will always be that way. And the world hates the Jewish people, and that is why we need a Jewish state. And that is an ideology that otherizes Jews. When you think about it, right? It is somehow dependent on anti-Semitism for its very existence. There's a kind of a troubling symbiotic relationship between Zionism and anti-Semitism that we need to somehow untangle when we're trying to contextualize and understand what anti-Semitism is and is not, and how it's being weaponized for those purposes. So
I think we do want to continue this thread that you've just introduced about what anti-Semitism is and is not. And you've introduced a sort of a working definition, but there's been a lot of activity in this area of whether and how to define and to redefine anti-Semitism in political bodies and ecumenical bodies. So what are these definitions, and why is this debate so contentious? How does this definitional debate affect Palestinians? And maybe, Dina, if you could weigh in on this first.
There has been an effort over the last almost 20 years to codify a definition of anti-Semitism, and it kind of originated in Europe in a kind of UN body that where actually pro-Israel groups introduced a definition of anti-Semitism that included what is termed kind of the new anti-Semitism that is related to Israel. So this was intended as a way to identify anti-Semitism for reporting purposes in Europe. And it was never really officially adopted, but proponents of this definition have since really, it has really been pushed throughout Europe and the United States on many levels. And this definition kind of starts with a relatively uncontroversial definition of what anti-Jewish hatred looks like.
So I think we do want to continue this thread that you've just introduced about what anti-Semitism is and is not. And you've introduced a sort of a working definition, but there's been a lot of activity in this area of whether and how to define and to redefine anti-Semitism in political bodies and ecumenical bodies. So what are these definitions, and why is this debate so contentious? How does this definitional debate affect Palestinians? And maybe, Dina, if you could weigh in on this first.
Yeah, so there has been an effort over the last almost 20 years to codify a definition of anti-Semitism, and it kind of originated in Europe in a kind of UN body where actually pro-Israel groups introduced a definition of anti-Semitism that included what is termed kind of the new anti-Semitism that is related to Israel. So this was intended as a way to identify anti-Semitism for reporting purposes in Europe. And it was never really officially adopted, but proponents of this definition have since really, it has really been pushed throughout Europe and the United States on many levels. And this definition kind of starts with a relatively uncontroversial definition of what anti-Jewish hatred looks like. But then it is focused, it gives examples. And several of those examples are focused on Israel. So what this definition says is, for example, that double standards against Israel are anti-Semitic, and demonization of Israel is anti-Semitic. Calling Israel a racist endeavor is anti-Semitic. And we've seen this kind of definition, which is now was taken up by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance and is now referred to as the Ira Definition of Anti-Semitism. It has been adopted by several European countries and institutions. It has also been pushed here in the U.S. through legislation. We've seen legislation pushed in the U.S. Congress that has failed. But then Donald Trump issued an executive order that adopts the definition for the purposes of federal agencies that are implementing anti-discrimination laws. So if there are accusations of anti-Semitism, this definition is to be used to identify what is anti-Semitic and what isn't. It has also been pushed in state legislatures. So Florida, of course, no surprise, has adopted this definition in its anti-discrimination laws, and in that bill, in that law, Florida law, it includes as anti-Semitic focusing human rights investigations only on Israel. So you're not allowed to just do a human rights investigation on Israel. You have to presumably do it about every other human rights issue in the country. So it goes with this idea of, you know, the way this definition originated was this notion of the 3 Ds: demonization, delegitimization, and double standards. So that's kind of integrated in this definition. If you delegitimize Israel, you're anti-Semitic. You can guess how this basically allows this definition to encompass any criticism of Israel. Anything you say could be deemed demonizing Israel. For example, if you call Israel an apartheid state, as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem have now done, based on very extensive evidence, that is deemed anti-Semitic. And they have been attacked as such, right? So this definition has become a tool to target individuals who criticize Israel. And what does this mean for Palestinians? It means that anything we say about our experiences as Palestinians, anything that we say that explains what Israel means for us, what Zionism means for us, gets us labeled as anti-Semitic. We are essentially gagged from opposing the state that has essentially tried to erase our existence and our identities and our resistance. That is the practical intent and the practical effect of this definition. It's to make it practically impossible to talk honestly and openly about Israel-Palestine without being accused of being anti-Semitic. As we've seen with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right? As we've seen with what people, well, she wasn't even talking about Israel. But as we see with so many people who, as soon as they express any solidarity with Palestinians or criticism of Israel, are attacked. So, you know, this is something that for Palestinians is fundamental to our ability to talk about our own experiences and the history and reality of the Palestinian experience. And you know, in my work at Palestine Legal, what we see on a daily basis is that this is the primary tool that is used to attack a grassroots movement for Palestinian rights in this country, and more in Europe as well, as we can talk more about. But here, this is a tool to attack people individually on an individual basis and make it too scary to engage on this issue. That is the fundamental purpose, is to chill our ability to talk about it for fear of being accused as such. So that's kind of to start us off on the definitional issue.
Just to add briefly, you know, I think we can compare this in some ways to the backlash we're seeing against critical race theory in this country too. I mean, these are their own issues and they have their own unique components to them, but it's also, I think what we're seeing is the weaponization of these accusations that the powerful understand can help them gain real political traction. And that's what really this is about. It's about gaining political power. And on Capitol Hill, on both sides, Republicans and Democrats, have learned that it's politically advantageous to use the cudgel of anti-Semitism, particularly against Palestinians or those who stand in solidarity with them. And this notion of, accusing, the 3 Ds, for instance, that are completely unquantifiable, and using those as an accusation that can be given a legal definition and have very, very real consequences for real people. I think we're seeing something similar going on in this country with the legacy, the racist legacy of this country, and this country beginning, just tentative beginnings of starting to grapple with that, and we're seeing that backlash happen. I believe Israel is a settler colonial state. I think this country is a settler colonial state. We began with a land acknowledgement, for God's sakes. We need to be able to talk about these things openly. But when weaponization happens, that creates a chilling effect. That people who are genuinely trying to come to grips with some really, really important aspects of the legacy of the place where they live, that is it's very difficult to stand up to because it creates fear. And I think this will lead into, eventually, I think, the importance of solidarity, ultimately, as the way to resist this weaponization.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning the critical race theory issue, Brant, because I think that is a critical analogy that we have to make, right? That if you look at the critical race theory laws that are being passed, again in Florida, no surprise, right? They are trying to tell teachers what they can and can't teach, and what they can and cannot say about race, and about sex, and about the history of the United States in their classrooms. And it's such a broad and ridiculous prohibition that it's impossible to understand what is and isn't allowed, in the same way that this definition of anti-Semitism is so vague and broad and ridiculous that no one could possibly understand what is and isn't demonization or delegitimization or whatever. So that's one point, just that it's they are both based on this completely broad-based attack on our ability to talk about things. And they're both targeting educational institutions, ultimately, right? So and they are both being pushed. Let's also kind of circle it back to this original question, or our previous discussion. They're both being pushed by right-wing actors, right? Right-wing groups like the American Legislative Exchange Commission, and other groups who are targeting educational institutions in general. So I think that's also really important.
So we are going to spend some time in a minute talking about the institutional effects of this weaponization of anti-Semitism. But I want to ask each of you a question about how you deal with this in personal conversations. Many people in this audience are familiar with having conversations about Israel and having and being shut down, and being shut down about Palestinian rights. How do you deal with that sort of situation when you are in a conversation, either one-on-one or in a small group?
I guess it's going to sound fairly obvious, but I think we need to learn how to stick our necks out and name these things out loud when they happen and not let them go by. And that's the beginning of what solidarity is being able to say these things out loud and put yourself on the line to a certain extent. And in an interpersonal way, it's, I don't want to overstate the case, but I talk with folks about this all the time. There are people who are terrified of bringing things up in their families, in conversation in their communities. And I also want to say, by the way, it goes both ways. This is an example I often bring up because it was a really important experience for me. I'll just say very quickly, I spoke on a panel a few years ago in Pittsburgh at a racism conference, and it was a panel after a documentary movie about Israeli apartheid. It was called Road to Apartheid. Strategic thing, I've shown it at some point, comparing South African and Israeli apartheid. And I spoke on a panel afterwards with a Palestinian and I think an African-American person. And after the movie was over, they opened it up for questions, and a Christian pastor, a white middle-aged man, raised his hand. He said, "I have a question for the rabbi." And he said, this was an amazing movie. This was such an important movie. How can we get this out there? Because we know that the Jews control the media, and it's going to be very difficult, to get the word out. And I was, that horrible moment where just there's that very uncomfortable silence, and I actually called him out on it and said that, I won't go into detail, but said, that kind of talk has no place in an anti-racism conference, and you need to think, et cetera, et cetera. And then the Palestinian on the panel said, he's absolutely right. There's no call for that kind of talk. And I can't tell you how much it meant to me to be backed up and to have that statement of solidarity, because I was feeling hanging out to dry on my own. And that's kind of what happens when you have to speak out, and that's why I feel it's so important to stand up particularly for Palestinian friends and comrades and colleagues who have to face this kind of stuff all the time. I mean, that was one example I can give, but for Palestinians, it's almost ubiquitous in their lives. So that being able to just take a breath and say out loud what needs to be said, I think, is the first step.
Second that. This is kind of our work every day as well, right? At How Legal, we have calls almost every day from people who are just devastated because they are being so viciously attacked for speaking out for Palestinian rights. And we have a lot of Palestinian Arab Muslim clients, but we also have a lot of non-Palestinian Arab Muslim clients, a lot of Jewish clients, and Black, Asian, Latino, whatever. The reality is that the kind of targeting that we're talking about here is very intentional, and it's severe. We haven't been in person for a long time, but the kind of the severity of the harassment that is happening online is really, it's hard to explain. I'm sure some of you could explain it because you yourselves have been targets. But what we see a lot of people who are targeted by these anonymous online websites that claim to be rooting out un-American behavior, right, and radical behavior, and they target people solely for their speech on Palestinian rights, and they dox them. I mean, they put out their personal information so that their followers then follow people on social media and direct message them. And we have clients who get death threats, rape threats, horrible threats against their families. And this isn't kind of theoretical, right? These are real people who are worried about their families back home in Palestine, who are worried about getting back in because they know that the Israeli security services look at sites like Canary Mission when they go home, when they try to get back home. So this is similar again to what we're seeing across the board with kind of right-wing doxing of intellectuals, of of scholars of color, of activists, etc. And it's a real problem. And I think what's most critical is to not leave folks alone, as I think Brent is saying as well. The most important support that we can provide is to make sure people understand that they are not alone in this, that they are, they will have backing and support and public support, right? So that's one of the things that we try to do, is really stand up for people publicly, to push their institutions or employers to understand what's behind these attacks, and to do that across the board, not just when it comes to Palestinian rights issues and these false accusations, but when we witness other racist incidents and anti-Semitic issues as well, right? It exists. Anti-Semitism exists everywhere, just as anti-blackness and anti-immigrant sentiments exist everywhere, and we have to call that out and stand up together against all these bigotries that really reinforce each other ultimately.
As a Jewish person who's aware of this resurgence of anti-Semitism that's both going on and being discussed a great deal, I've noticed in the Jewish community this tendency to kind of circle the wagons when these things happen. You hear things like, "Oh, it's happening. It's happening again. No one has reached out to me." This kind of feel like we only have ourselves. And that's a very, I think, particularly post-Holocaust, it's a very common psychological collective psychology of the Jewish community. And on the one hand, I guess I understand the trauma where that comes from, and I also, I want to say that I feel there's an insidious aspect to that the desire to withdraw and to isolate when these things happen. And I got involved in probably more than I should have social media conversations from Jewish friends who were complaining that they didn't hear from any of their non-Jewish friends after Kalivo happened. And I said, well, there are mosques being attacked and Asian Americans being attacked on a regular basis as well. Have you been reaching out to your Muslim or African American or Asian American friends when these things happen? I think we need to understand that whereas there may be this desire, this kind of primal desire to isolate, I think we need to find ways to use these moments as moments of empathy, because that's the only way we're going to get through this.
Thank you for those thoughtful and helpful answers. We're going to talk about how false definitions of anti-Semitism have led to attacks on civil liberties at this moment. We've seen many forms of criminalization enacted in the name of anti-Semitism, and which exploit concerns about Jewish safety, including Israel's recent naming of 6 of the largest and strongest Palestinian civil rights organizations as terrorist organizations. And we live in the state of Illinois, which was the first state to enact anti-BDS legislation that has since proliferated in other states. How and why is the US and global Palestine solidarity movement such a big target of the Israeli and US governments, as well as pro-Israel civil society groups? What are the broader implications of these attacks on the Palestine movement?
So I think we've kind of touched on, we've touched a little on the way that false accusations are used to target the Palestine movement, but I think it's important to understand the much broader context that this is happening in. We have seen for a couple of decades in particular a widespread, concerted effort to target the movement for Palestinian rights. And that's because in the last couple of decades, this movement has really grown. Why? Again, it has taken us this long to kind of get to what is at the center of all of this in the first place, and that is what's happening in Palestine. This is fundamentally about the Palestinian experience of dispossession, of occupation, living under occupation, and living in an apartheid reality for the last many, many decades because of the establishment of the State of Israel, because of the Zionist project of turning historic Palestine into a state that privileges Jews over indigenous Palestinians. This is what has been happening in the US over the last 20 years, is that there has been a growing a growing grassroots movement here that has seen Israel's ferocious attacks on Gaza in 2008, 2009, Cast-led in 2014, where we saw hundreds of Palestinians in Gaza killed and the infrastructure destroyed. And there were mass protests that happened all over the United States. It's the age of social media where this is being really live streamed to us, right? Where we see one of the most advanced militaries in the world attacking a besieged population in Gaza. Not to mention the daily humiliations of life in the West Bank for Palestinians under occupation. So that's what this is fundamentally about. A movement here that has grown in solidarity with Palestinians who are experiencing this oppression. And Israel has seen this, and it's a threat. And the movement is not just protests, but it's based on activism that has grown around the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, right? Based on the South African BDS tactic. So with this growing grassroots movement and these tactics that have generated a lot of discussion and debate on college campuses, for example, where students are bringing divestment resolutions, calling on their universities to divest their funds from companies complicit in Israel's occupation. These are threats to what has been in this country an almost unconditional support for Israel. So Israel's response has really been to ramp up the attacks. The primary pillars of those attacks have been this attempt to define anti-Semitism and use false accusations, but also accusations of terrorism or support for terrorism. That's kind of the other pillar that we see. It takes many forms, and it's coming from a lot of directions. Again, with my work at Palestine Legal, we really try to document what's happening here. And it's not just these individual attacks here and there, right? This is a concerted effort. Yes, universities, campuses have been a primary target in the form of not just targeting of students, but also discrimination complaints, claims that universities are tolerating anti-Semitic environments because there's a lot of Palestine activism on campus. Also in the form of lawsuits. Lawsuits against the Olympia Food Co-op, for example, for endorsing a boycott of Israeli goods. Against the American Studies Association for endorsing an academic boycott of Israeli institutions, right? Lawsuits against all kinds of, one of the biggest U.S.-based advocacy groups in this country, the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, accusing it of material support for terrorism because it supported the Great March of Return in Gaza. Right? There's a lawsuit that is trying to hold liable a U.S. advocacy group for the burning of Jewish National Fund forests in 48 Israel, right? So the claim is that because there were flammable kites and balloons let off during the Great March of Return in Gaza that burned JNF forests that were planted over destroyed Palestinian villages, let's not forget, that U.S. campaign's tweets in support of the Great March makes it liable for this damage that allegedly Hamas created, and therefore U.S. campaign is Hamas and they're liable for whatever, right? So there's this use and abuse of anti-terrorism legislation to target Palestine advocacy. And as you allude to, Janet, there's also legislation, right? So this is coming from our elected officials who are being directly lobbied by Israeli officials to enact legislation targeting the boycott movement. So 32 states now have legislation in force that punishes people or entities that engage in BDS. So some of these laws actually require contractors with the state to sign a certification that they do not and will not boycott Israel as long as they contract with the state. There is a range of tactics being used to attack individuals, groups, the movement as a whole, and it's being done from above, right? We have elected officials who are taking up these calls from the Israeli government and Israeli officials to target our movement. So I think this is what we're seeing on the ground is a really a situation where any activism, any kind of expression of solidarity has become, you're putting your career on the line, basically. Over the spring and summer with the Palestinian uprising, the Unity uprising, we saw an unprecedented number of folks speaking out, just like individuals in whatever sector they work or operate in, taking positions and putting out statements of solidarity. And the number of people we heard from who were called in by their HR departments because there were complaints against them, right? And some were fired, right, for stating publicly on their social media or wherever that they support Palestinian rights. That's the level of targeting that we're seeing of individuals, but also of groups of academic associations, of universities, and the result has been really an undermining of our fundamental rights to engage, of our First Amendment rights. I want to circle back to just this fact that this is not unique in the sense that all of our movements for social justice are being attacked. We have legislation, we talked a little bit about the critical race theory legislation, but there's also legislation targeting protests, racial justice protests, anti-protest legislation around the country that is targeting tactics that the Black Lives Matter movement has used. critical infrastructure legislation that's targeting the anti-pipeline protests by indigenous and environmental justice activists, right? This is, and again, it's all being pushed by the same actors. ALEC is behind all of this legislation. It brings together conservative legislators from around the country and gives them this model legislation. And it's just a template, right? So a clear example of that is that these anti-boycott laws that I mentioned that require you to sign, certify that you won't boycott Israel, are now being used, the same template, to target companies that boycott the fossil fuel industry, right? Texas, no surprise, has a law that if you contract with the state, you have to certify that you don't boycott the fossil fuel industry or the gun industry, right? So fill in the blanks. Fill in the blanks. We are in a situation where it might be easier to target boycotts for Palestinian rights because they're not popular. Our elected officials are almost entirely united against our right to boycott for our rights. But what boycott is it going to target next? And boycotts, as the Supreme Court has said, are fundamental First Amendment rights. So we're seeing a widespread, across-the-board attack on our constitutional rights. And I think we can extrapolate that to all of our constitutional rights: voting rights, our right to privacy, our right to choice, right? So we have to think about this expansively and connect the dots and understand what's really at stake here. It's not just our ability to talk about Palestine, but about all of our efforts to really change the status quo and see effective change for justice.
Just thank you for that, Nima. It's so important. Yeah, I think we see it happening over and over in the case of Palestinians because that's, and again, it's Democrats and Republicans. There's very little political cost, for taking those stands. That's an easy one for them. But I think we need to connect those dots and contextualize this as part of a larger movement. And if I could maybe just tweak it a little differently. I mean, it feels overwhelming and daunting when we hear about this onslaught. But the other way to think about this, and I think Dina was right to frame this in the context of backlash, because historically, when we see this kind of a political onslaught, it's from a power that sees its power starting to slip away from it. And they see the numbers changing in this country, they see the demographics changing in this country, they see the grassroots starting to grow and mobilize in ways they haven't seen before. They see laws that are getting passed where things are being taught that they're not happy about, or people being included and tolerated in ways that they're not happy about. And it happens over and over. It happened going back to Reconstruction in this country and voting rights, and even well before that when the powers that be, generally the white majority, feels their power starting to be fundamentally challenged, we see this kind of backlash occur. And so I think we need to understand that both in terms of tactically, but I think, I think what DEMA does and groups like Legal are so important because we need to defend the people who are on the front lines who need defending. And I'm sure it often feels like whack-a-mole that there's just so many that are. But we need to defend people whose lives and careers and livelihoods are on the line. But we also can't completely fall into a defensive strategy. That this is happening, so that means that what we're doing on some level is meaningful and is getting their attention, and we need to double down on all levels, whether it's grassroots organizing, whether it's visiting our representatives, and there are people in this room who have done that with many, many times, that we can't hold back, we can't be daunted by the backlash, because the backlash is really ultimately a sign of a kind of a desperation. But powerful, powers can do a lot of damage on their way down, even as their power is being challenged, so we can't take that lightly. But I also think we can take heart in the fact that the reason this is happening is because what we have been doing has been making a difference.
Well, thank you. I said at the beginning I could think of no better guides for this conversation, and that proved to be true. I learned something every time I hear from either of you, and this was no exception. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so we have 3 questions that have something to do with tying our conversation to the situation in Ukraine. So I'm going to read the 3 of them, and you can respond to any or all of them. Why do you think corporations, individuals, and our government are so willing to jump on the BDS bandwagon when it comes to the Ukraine situation, but will not do the same when it comes to Israel-Palestine? How is anti-Semitism being abused and weaponized in the Russian attack on Ukraine by the president, related to the president of Ukraine, by Israel, by pro-Israel lobby, by the mainstream media in its refusal to recognize Israeli attacks on Gaza, settler colonialism in East Jerusalem, etc. And we are learning that numbers of Russian oligarchs have Israeli citizenship and are major funders of Jewish charities. How does this fit with anti-Semitism?
Oh, well, yeah, the BDS bandwagon when it comes to Ukraine and Israel-Palestine, it's Europe. I mean, it's, yeah, it's called racism, I guess, is the one word answer to that. I mean, it certainly doesn't surprise me. Historically, this country has had no trouble sanctioning other countries for all kinds of reasons. And it comes down to what they see as what is politically expedient and in their quote-unquote national interest, and often driven by, who their allies are. So that's that one. What was the second one?
About anti-Semitism being weaponized in the
Russian. Yeah, that's not such an easy question. I don't know enough about what's going on in Putin's head to be able to really comment about his statements about denazifying Ukraine. I mean, there may be people here who can address that better. I don't know how much of it is weaponizing fears of anti-Semitism, and how much of it is, the political calculus that he's been considering. It's I don't know that I would just say that anti-Semitism is all that's going on when Putin makes these claims. And the situation in Ukraine, is enormously complex, and I can recommend some good reading, but it's not easy. There's a Jewish president, and there are neo-Nazi militias that are fighting, on Ukraine's behalf, and then Israel is trying to figure out how best to leverage its, politically to insert itself, and it's not easy for them given their past relationship between Russia and Ukraine. One thing they are, which I think is not surprising to me, is the number of Jewish Ukrainians that they're taking in. Again, it's, there's millions of refugees, and they're saying, well, the Jewish ones can come to Israel. And there's something, this goes back to what we were saying about the nature of an ethno-national enterprise, that you're going to pick and choose the refugees that are going to help you gain a demographic advantage is just, I think, is really it's a hard one to stomach, at least for many of us. And the last question about the oligarchs. How does, I guess I'm not quite sure what the question is. How does it dovetail with anti-Semitism? How does it doesn't do the cause of Jews any good to have billionaire Jew, but it's not only, there's plenty of oligarchs that are not Jewish who are out there, and that needs to be lifted up. I think I have all kinds of intra-communal conversations about who our institutions take money from, and I think this might be a teachable moment for many Jewish organizations when they might reconsider the source of the funding that they get. While as a Jew, I'm ashamed of this behavior, and there's a part of me that feels like, well, this is just going to stoke more anti-Semitism because it fits every stereotype that anti-Semites have about Jews. It's also important to point out that there's plenty of oligarchs to go around, and when people are only focusing on a certain group of them, I think we need to broaden and recontextualize what's really going on. This is not about some kind of Jewish conspiracy, and we need to call it out if it becomes more explicit.
I can maybe add to the first question, why are corporations, governments, et cetera, so quick to boycott Russia. The way that the anti-boycott laws have been framed partly answers that. They prohibit or punish boycotts against allies. Sometimes they name Israel and sometimes they don't. But the idea that only some kinds of boycotts are okay if we agree with their purpose, that's the message it's sending, that the government can decide what is okay and not okay to boycott or to criticize or to protest or whatever. And that is fundamentally contrary to the First Amendment, the notion that the government cannot dictate what is okay and not okay to say or to not do, but okay to say and advocate for. So I think that's important to note. And obviously, like the arguments against boycotts, the Palestinian boycotts, that's kind of encompassed in these anti-boycott laws is the idea that they're discriminatory. And that's why it's okay for the government to prohibit them or punish them. So it takes this idea that because people are boycotting Israel, it is a form of anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish discrimination and national origin discrimination against Israel. And that's a fundamental misconstruction of the Palestinian call for boycott, which is very carefully targeting complicity with the Israeli occupation, with the apartheid regime, etc. So I think that's a really important conversation that's also happening, right? And I would encourage everyone to look at the Boycott National Committee's statement about this very issue and the ways that this rush to boycott anything and everything that's Russian, right? Because it's Russian, because they are Russian, not because of any other reason, not because of the political stance of someone or an institution or whatever. It kind of puts a lie to this obsession with BDS for Palestinian rights being discriminatory, right? This is so clearly the way that this kind of blanket boycott on anything Russian is being is playing out is actually fundamentally different from the way that the Palestinian call for boycott and campaigns are being implemented. They are not against Israeli individuals. for being Israeli, or Israeli institutions for being Israeli, or companies for being Israeli. They are against, a lot of U.S. companies that that are complicit, that enable Israel's actions. So I think that's really important too.
Yeah. The one more piece of that is, historical context can be helpful. That when we look at South Africa and the history of how sanctions in this country evolved, there was this anti-apartheid act that eventually was passed in Congress. It was vetoed by President Reagan, and then they overrode his veto, but it happened. And I think part of what we see about the anti-BDS legislation is fear that this works. That historically the people pushing this legislation understand history, and they know that this kind of economic leverage has historically made a difference in the past. So again, I think it's a kind of a fear-based backlash approach, and we need to be able to point to other historical examples to demythologize this nonsense about how it's singling out one country and not others.
I want to, at this point, apologize because there are an extraordinary number of really, really good questions here. And I can tell you now that we're not going to be able to get to all of them, and I'm truly sorry about that because they are very good questions. But we'll get through as many as we can. In contrast to anti-Semitism, there is in America an emotional good feeling for Israel that is immune to anything Israel does to the Palestinians. How do you explain this seemingly contradictory situation? I speak of the general population, not of Christian fundamentalists.
I think that general good feeling is starting to ebb, actually. And I think if I was asked to explain it, I think a lot of it has to do with the Holocaust, and the way that Israel's birth, coming on the heels of the Holocaust, has created this narrative, this narrative that's very, very compelling and very powerful, and led to a great deal of goodwill on the international community as well as in this country toward Israel. And I think generationally, I think we're seeing that goodwill starting to ebb, and certainly just within the Jewish community, every demographic study of the attitudes of the Jewish community are showing that younger Jews aren't sharing that goodwill as their parents and grandparents' generations have, because what Dima was talking about, that things are much more thanks to social media and just, I think both a combination of just the ferocity of Israel's oppression, which is getting harder and harder to deny, and the fact that it's brought to our, to our door through digital media so quickly. I think it's getting harder to keep that good feeling going and hand it down to the next generation. But I think if I was asked as to why it exists, I would say it has to do with a very powerful narrative of death and rebirth, and redemption. That Israel and Zionists, the Israeli government and Zionists have, exploited, to be honest, for in some ways very cynical political reasons.
I would add, this is really all aided as well by the almost complete silencing of Palestinian voices, and in mainstream circles, right, in mainstream media, and also institutionally, yes, the kind of, now there are so many other forums for Palestinian voices to be heard, that has certainly changed things, I think, where you hear directly from Palestinians on the ground about what's happening. But even leftist publications like The Nation, they just hired their first Palestinian reporter, right? Mohammed al-Kurd, who was instrumental in in broadcasting to the world what was happening in Sheikh Jarrah last spring, where Palestinian families are again being kicked out of their homes to make way for Jewish settlers. So I think there is still just a fundamental lack of interest in what Palestinians themselves have to say. And you know, I have to say that I see this directly in our work. When we have Palestinian clients, nobody wants to cover their stories of being targeted and having their voices silenced, and you know, that has been a theme, right? And you know, on the other hand, I think Jewish clients don't have that same problem, right? A lot of people are interested in inter-Jewish, the kind of schisms that are happening within the Jewish community, and this is covered a lot. I would add, this is really all aided as well by the almost complete silencing of Palestinian voices, and in mainstream circles, right, in mainstream media and also institutionally, yes, the kind of, now there are so many other forums for Palestinian voices to be heard, that has certainly changed things, I think, where you hear directly from Palestinians on the ground about what's happening. But you know, even leftist publications like The Nation, they just hired their first Palestinian reporter, right, Mohammed al-Kurd, who was instrumental in broadcasting to the world what was happening in Sheikh Jarrah last spring, where Palestinian families are again being kicked out of their homes to make way for Jewish settlers. So I think there is still just a fundamental lack of interest in what Palestinians themselves have to say. And you know, I have to say that I see this directly in our work. When we have Palestinian clients, nobody wants to cover their stories of being targeted and having their voices silenced, and you know, that has been a theme, right? And you know, on the other hand, I think Jewish clients don't have that same problem, right? A lot of people are interested in inter-Jewish, the kind of schisms that are happening within the Jewish community, and this is covered a lot. But you know, when our client Ahmed David was attacked, he became the first Palestinian American student senator at his school in Florida again. And immediately he was attacked. Immediately his social media was trolled. They dug to posts he made when he was 12, saying F the occupation, F Israel. And he was slammed. I mean, the kind of death threats I was talking about on social media. But not only that, the state legislators started attacking him and pressuring the university to get him out of his student government position. There were city councils in Florida that were issuing resolutions about him, not even where FSU is based, like just, why does that matter to them, right? All under this guise that what he was saying was anti-Semitic and he couldn't represent the student body, right? These are things that we're seeing every day, and it's not covered, right? This kind of targeting of Palestinians who are trying to express their experiences or who are reacting to things. is constantly undermined. So I think that's one thing as well. And I do think that with this spring uprising, and this is, I think this is probably because of what the racial justice uprisings we've seen as well. There's been a kind of shift, and you know what? We need to hear Black people talk about their own oppression, and you know, Black people have been organizing for centuries, literally, for their liberation, and they know what they want, and they have, you know, they have organized for many decades, right? So the same kind of logic clicked in some ways. Oh, let's hear from Palestinians, actually. And so that's what we need more of, I think. And once you start hearing directly from Palestinians about what is going on and what their experiences are, that starts to shift the view of Israel-Palestine and what's going on there. So I encourage, you know, that to really be a focus for folks to seek out those voices and really to go there. I think that's one of the only ways that we can start to shift opinions here, because when people see for themselves what's happening, I think it becomes crystal clear what's going on.
We're going to be able to get to a few more questions, but first we have Rebecca Levin from the Committee for a Just Peace in Israel and Palestine to talk about an action step that we are requesting.
But we want to talk to you for 1 second about what you can do. About 45 minutes ago, a gentleman got up and walked out and he said, "This is really good, but this is just so upsetting. My stomach is in knots. I got to get out of here." And this is in response to that yes, when you just listen and you learn and you understand and then you don't do anything, all it does is make you nuts. And so what we are encouraging you to do is take action. And there are a number of things that you can do. One of them is that when Lynn passed around the ad that was taken out about the Amnesty International report, you have to know that that report, that ad, we were not allowed to publish in the Sun-Times. Sun-Times did not accept that ad. And what is that ad saying? This ad is advertising the Amnesty International's report that called Israel's behavior in the country apartheid. And Amnesty International, the organization that's most highly regarded as a human rights organization around the world, can't get their information published just as a regular news report. So we decided to take out an advertisement, and Sun-Times won't print it. And the Tribune buried it deep into its section on home life or something like that. So if anyone is wondering, what is it that we need to do? First of all, be aware of the fact that the silencing of voices that Dina was just talking about is happening here, is happening now with our voices, whether we are Palestinian, whether we are, whoever we are when we're speaking up about Palestinian rights. And that's something that we have to be aware of and then speak out about. As you leave the event today, we're going to be passing out these little forms to you. And in it talks about HR 751. This is a resolution that Benny McCullum has proposed to condemn the United States for condemning the 6 organizations that Dina mentioned earlier, the human rights organizations in Palestine as Palestinian terrorist organizations. These are organizations that are critical for the well-being and the protection of Palestinian children, women, prisoners' rights, etc. And they've been now labeled as terrorist organizations, and therefore their money is being cut off. So what we ask you to do are 2 things. One, on this form, there is a telephone number at the bottom. If you don't know the telephone number, the name and/or telephone number of your representative, either U.S. representative or Illinois representatives, if you call this number, you will be referred to it. It's not it will work for anyone, anywhere. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rebecca. Well, it's breaking my heart that I can't ask all of these questions because they really are great, but we only have the room for 10 more minutes. So I'm going to I think what I'm going to have to do is ask just one more question and then ask Dima and Brent to just give us their last takeaway words to share with us. And unfortunately, it's a gigantic question, so good luck with this. The accusation of singling out Israel and hence alleged anti-Semitism conveniently ignores the unique role of Israel in helping project U.S. power and control in the world. Could you give a brief summary of this unique role over the past few decades and how this might change with the so-called pivot towards Asia? Okay. Yeah. It is a really big question, but I wanted to read it because it's an example of the extraordinarily thoughtful way that you are coming at this issue. Obviously, it's too big to answer and then get out of the room at 4 o'clock. But I did want to share the thoughtfulness of this group, and thank you for that.
I think in general, though, I think it's a really important thing to connect those dots in the ways that, you know, the national interests of this country and the national interests of Israel are symbiotic. They go, and it goes both ways. So I think the larger geopolitical view is a really important piece of this. Israel isn't doing this in a vacuum, and the unconditional support that America gives happens for a reason. Geopolitics is always a really important perspective.
I'm going to just go ahead and invite the two of you to make your closing remarks, anything that you want to say, to summarize, or to expand upon something that you have talked about already. Please do.
I think one of the most important things to take away here is really that we can't separate the fight for Palestinian rights from the fight against anti-Semitism and all other forms of bigotry and hatred and the divisions that we see. I think there's this notion that in order to protect Jews, you have to this state of Israel as it is necessary, and that requires the oppression of Palestinians, the dispossession of Palestinians, and we have to separate those things in order, or if we are committed to everyone deserving safety and equality and freedom. It is impossible to have Israel as a Jewish state, as a state that privileges Jews over everyone else, without enacting another kind of discrimination and another kind of oppression. So it is possible for us to fight anti-Semitism and to advocate for the safety of Jews and for even Jewish self-determination, and also support Palestinian rights to self-determination and freedom from oppression. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. And in order to get to that place, we have to be able to criticize and really pick apart what Zionism is, and the political ideology that allows for the creation of a state on the destroyed villages and the refugee status of a people, right? This state has created a situation in the Middle East that in fact really makes Jewish people less safe in a way, right? You cannot have a state of Israel, without a kind of recognition of what it has caused and facing that reality and really dissecting what it means to move forward from here, right? With the reality that there is now an Israeli state and an Israeli nationality and millions of Jewish people who now live in Israel, right? What do we do with that? And what is the framework that we have to work from in order to reach a point where we can say that justice is served and everybody's safe and equal and free? I don't think that that this is not easy, and I don't know that we have a model, right? South Africa isn't the best model. The United States certainly isn't the best model, and we have a reality of right now this incredible right-wing push where states like Israel and Hungary and Putin are being idolized, right? Where there's an undermining of this notion of international law, of the very system that allowed for us to say that we will not let World War II happen again. We will not let the Holocaust happen again. We have these fundamental principles that we have to function upon as a global community. All of that is being undermined, right? And how do we come back to a place where we all agree that there have to be these fundamental rules and these fundamental rights that everyone has to abide by, including our very own country, right? There can be no exceptions. There cannot be an exception for Israel. There can't be an exception for Russia. And there can't be an exception for the US.
That's a hard act to follow. I say amen to everything Dima said. I think what I take away from what she's saying is that we have to fight the mentality that the only way I can be safe is if someone else is rendered unsafe. The zero-sum view perspective on safety, that somehow it's a limited quantity to go around. And right, we don't have a lot of good models to look at, but that doesn't mean that that's the principle of safety through solidarity, that safety is actually, that security for all is actually not only desirable but possible, that we have to keep that attitude, and to call out the attitude that only the most powerful have entitlement to safety and security at the expense of everyone else. The other thing I just want to say is that I'm very happy to speak here, and I'm really honored to be asked to speak. There's always a part of me that I think lately is feeling a little bit of hesitation to speak on this subject. Not because I don't think anti-Semitism is not an important issue to talk about. It's an extremely important issue, but it is being discussed a great deal in the mainstream media and in the world at large. And sometimes it feels like almost at the exception of other forms of hatreds that are out there. And I don't want to exceptionalize anti-Semitism by speaking about it in a vacuum, which is why I'm glad we had the opportunity to connect those dots today. But I think we need to consistently do that. You know, when there's an anti-Semitic incident, it is on the front page of most papers in this country. When a black child is killed by the police, we'll be lucky if it makes the paper at all. And I have Jewish friends who happen to be African American who point this out to me, that whenever there's a terrible anti-Semitic incident, it is painful for them on so many levels, both as a Jew but also as a person of color who is just wondering why the world isn't up in arms about what's going on to people of color in this country, in some ways on a more regular basis than violent anti-Semitism. So the other part is that there's so much more that we could be saying, and it's a vast issue, and I hope we've been able to at least chisel away at some of the more important points. And I really honor the fact that you've been able to stay here for 2 hours and talk about really informative things.
Clearly, there's so much more to talk about, to think about. If we had, in fact, started this program 2 years ago, we would still be talking at this point. And I want to thank you all so much for being here.